Hi everyone, welcome to your lecture on what are games, which is a continuation of the previous lecture on what is play. So to jump back into my main man, Johann Huizinga, who coined the term the magic circle, and I'm going to read this full quote. Huizinga described play as occurring within a magic circle. All play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand, either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice, etc. are all in form and function playgrounds. Forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart. So this idea of the magic circle has had a lot of scholarship written about it in game studies. So we're going to talk a little bit about that now, and this way of conceptualizing what games are and whether or not they're really separate, as Huizinga describes here. This conceptualization of play as separate from everyday life and therefore not serious or unproductive has its roots in Protestant work ethic. It's by no means universal. Martin Luther, this handsome chap, conceptualized work as a duty that benefits both the individual and the society as a whole. The notion of good works was transformed into an obligation to diligently work as a sign of grace. Therefore, anything in kind of this Protestant work ethic that wasn't productive good work was seen of low or poor value, play being one of those things. But this is by no means a universal orientation towards play. And as we'll see in this unit, play is something that can be serious and productive. In any case, Huizinga embedded a lot of these ideas as a German scholar in his work. And then this concept of the magic circle was adopted by Erich Zimmermann and Katie Sarlin in their book Rules of Play, where they use the magic circle as a shorthand to refer to what a game is, a special place in time and space created by a game. The magic space it circumscribes is enclosed and separate from the real world. So we see how Huizinga's kind of bigger concept is condensed down in this form. And I'm going through this because there's a lot of papers on this magic circle debate that I want you to kind of understand when you're going into doing some research for your essays and your game design assignment. So all of this contemporary scholarship really emerged that disagreed with this, particularly in the context of virtual world games and mobile games, where a clear delineation between the game and not game isn't so clear. Erich Zimmermann himself described this debate as the magic circle jerk. The argument going something like this. The idea of the magic circle is the idea that games are completely separate from ordinary life. The magic circle naively champions pre-existing rules of a game and ignores the fact that games are lived experiences played by human beings in some kind of real, social and cultural context. So don't get caught in this non-debate, but I think it's really interesting to again see how scholars kind of where scholars are positioned as intellectuals influences the kind of conceptualizations that come up, as we saw in the last lecture about play, but also here about what a game is. Rules of Play is a games design textbook, and the idea of the magic circle there is to start is as a shorthand for the task of games design, to start thinking about how we understand when we're playing that some things are in and some things are out of the play space. But that is not to say that there is a clear delineation between what goes on and out. And there are a lot of attempts to define games. Over 60. Jaco Stenros published an article in Games and Culture on the game definition game that identified over 60 different definitions of games since the 1930s. This helps uncover some of the things that they agree on and disagree on. And he provides a toolkit for trying to work out where you stand on this topic. Is this useful? Or does this help us recognize that maybe definitions aren't necessary to be able to understand what it is, that there exists no true objective definition of what a game is, and is this pursuit worthwhile at all? To kind of explore that, let's have a look at a range of definitions from Jarkko Stenros's The Game Definition Game. Clark Abt describes play in his book Serious Games, which we'll talk a little bit more about next week, as an activity among two or more independent decision makers seeking to achieve their objectives in some limiting context. Straight away, I can say, well, what about single games? But maybe we can think about the second actor as the game's design. Elliot Avenden and Brian Sutton Smith describe games as an exercise of voluntary control systems. Games are in which there is an opposition between forces combined by a procedure and rules in order to produce a disequilibrial outcome, which is my favourite academic speak for someone wins. Bernard Suits really draws on this idea, really emphasises the voluntary nature of play in his definition in The Grasshopper. Quoting, "To play a game is to engage in activity directed towards bringing about a specific state of affairs, using only means permitted by rules, where rules prohibit more efficient in favour of less efficient means, and where such rules are accepted just because they make possible such an activity. Playing a game is a voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles." This idea of unnecessary obstacles is really useful when we start to try and think about the ethics of competition in play, which is the topic that we'll tackle later in the unit. Roger Caillois's similar definition describes play as having essential conditions of being free, that is voluntary, separate in time and space, uncertain, unproductive, governed by rules, and make-believe, that is, there are imaginary elements to it. Greg Costigan's definition from the 90s describes a game as a form of art in which participants, termed players, make decisions in order to manage resources through game tokens in the pursuit of some goal. The problem with these definitions is that they're all perfectly valid, but saying that a game is a form of art in which participants, termed players, make decisions in order to manage resources through game tokens in pursuit of a goal is like saying that film is a sequence of images of moving objects photographed by a camera and providing the optical illusion of continuous movement when projected onto a screen. Does it help us understand games and play better and access what it is that we want to do when we're studying and talking critically about games? If we think back to some of those reasons why we study games. So how useful is any of this? Wittgenstein is a fairly well-known linguistic scholar who argues against searching for essential real definitions. A topic I've really not gotten into in this lecture is I've really been focused here on English language definitions. Of course, the terms games and play have different meanings and different conjunctions in other languages, which kind of, again, kind of speaks to the fruitlessness of an attempt to define what a game is, even though this is our central object of study in this course. So Wittgenstein argues against searching for these essential or real definitions, suggesting that concepts should be understood as sharing family resemblances. And defining games is used as his example of how impossible this is. So Ari-Otto a Finnish scholar, argues that if Wittgenstein is indeed right, there may be no single definition for games. Instead of having a common core of attributes, games share attributes as family resemblances, which vary from one instance to another, forming a continuum or set rather than a single thing called games. And I like this kind of approach and this takeaway because formal approaches are exclusionist. Formal approaches to defining games that insist on certain fundamental elements of what a game is marginalize the video games that do not meet these essentially arbitrary criteria, even if they rank among the most popular video games of all time. For example, Jesper Juhl, a very notable and influential early video game scholar in the 2000s, persistent privileging of his fundamental rule-based gameness through his classic game model dismisses fictional worlds as optionally imagined and sidelines the immensely popular SimCity and simulation game genre entirely as they lack explicit goals, essentially excluding them from his philosophical treatment of games. We also see this in another non-debate, with the earlier non-debate being a magic circle jerk, in the ludology versus narratology debate. So this ludology versus narratology debate, in which some scholars studying games declared themselves ludologists, led by Espen Aarseth, the founder of the journal Game Studies, styled themselves as being in opposition to other scholars who they called narratologists, exemplified by scholars like Janet Murray and Henry Jenkins. The narratologists were scholars who were supposedly looking at games as narrative texts, the way that they have previously looked at books and films, whereas the ludologists were looking at the procedures and rules of the game and not as concerned with narrative or aesthetic trappings. And you might enjoy the meme on the Canvas module. The problem with the ludology versus narratology debate, this meme describes how many think it was a bit of a non-debate. Did it even really happen, or was it just junior scholars wanting to really define themselves as something different from lit studies, narrative studies, and other disciplines that have come before? Is that it was actually about the proper way to study games. Seems like some people who were doing research about narrative or representation or culture in games, and then other people, these ludologists, arguing that that research wasn't worth doing, or it wasn't as important, because they were trying to draw attention to the aspects of games that were not about the rules and the procedures, but the ludologists in their positioning were opposed to that. So this is just another example of how trying to emphasize these formal definitions and creating a hierarchy of this quality of the family of resemblances of games makes it more like a game, works to exclude some scholars and some perspectives. I also end up at this kind of perspective because of social constructionism, which is a theory of knowledge, essentially, that informs a lot of my work, that essentially concludes that all knowledge, and therefore all meaningful reality as such, is contingent on human practices being constructed in and out of interactions between human beings and their work, developed and transmitted within, again, an essentially social context. The consequence of this epistemological stance is the assertion that the realization that multiple social realities exist. There's no single true or valid interpretation of reality, and it is impossible to access it if it did exist. But rather, all we have is interpretations that can be useful, liberating, revealing, and guiding. Any interpretation, be it a theory of play influenced by the changes in Victorian era England, the Darwinian theory of evolution connecting us to animals more than ever before, or a theory of games that is influenced by our Protestant work ethic deeply embedded within the culture in which we're doing our scholarship. All interpretations are couched in these kinds of historical, social, and cultural contexts. It's not to deny the existence of this true external reality, but just its accessibility, and note, objectively representing that is entirely fruitless. So to give you an example of where we can then go if we kind of acknowledge this limitation of the pursuit of defining games, is to then break this central object apart and go, what is it that I want to do in the academic work? And then what is my definition of my central object of study? Because I realize that influences how I might approach and study it. And this kind of read is really useful for when kind of interrogating in depth some of the required readings in this work and the other readings that you might attempt in your assignments. So Brendan Keogh, for example, is a proponent of video game studies. That's video game, one word, not two, about which there are many fights on Twitter. Keogh wants to treat the video game as not as a subset of a game, just one form of game, but as something entirely different. He defines the video game as an audiovisual haptic medium, where what is done with the hands, what is looked at on the screen, and what is heard from the speakers in concert constitute the embodied expression that the video game provides. Without the movement of fingers, the colours on the screen that constitute the paddle and the ball and the bricks and the beeps that indicate collisions, there is no experience of breakout to otherwise consider. The video game is not simply a rule set, with which the player makes decisions, but a distributed corporeality that the player corporeally becomes a part of. And so here he's referring to the video game Breakout, which is when you've got the paddle on the bottom of the screen and you bounce the balls up and down. Yes, there's a simulation here and rules, but when we're really trying to understand the experience of this, is viewing this as a set of rules and simulations how we want to unpack what we want to study here, or is viewing it as this kind of combined audio visual haptic medium where we're kind of disembodied and embodied within the game world? My kind of take on this is some recent work that I actually did on the TV series Survivor, was actually starting to think about multiplayer games, particularly very competitive multiplayer games, as something fundamentally different to single player games. And here, based on work by a scholar called Clifford Geertz, who's an old philosophy of science scholar who was kind of trying to develop an understanding of what disciplines were, how it was that we can't really define what physics is, but it kind of the sort of thing emerges through social interactions. I define multiplayer games as a moral economy, where different types of play are given different values by players. Valuing certain play acts, styles, and strategies and events over other instances of play is intrinsic to the function of competitive multiplayer games. It's only through valuing play that win conditions are established or can be met. So paper beats rock, longest road in Settlers of Catan, you sunk my battleship. These are rules that have the effect of valuing certain play over others so that those win conditions meet. But rules are not the only way in which this happens. If my enthusiastic sliding tackle in the final of my under-30 soccer tournament was valued quite highly, but when I used the same move against my 6-year-old nephew at a family gathering, it was very much looked down upon. So by decentering rules in the way that we might understand multiplayer games as moral economies, we can start to really recognize the equal importance that social, cultural, historical contexts have on changing the way that this play is valued. And so in the work cited here, I look at Survivor final tribal councils as a way to unpack and investigate how is it that certain things like treachery and betrayal become valued through various kind of hegemonic masculinities and cultural ideas of sportsmanship and chivalry and our hope for the good guy to win in the end always. So all these approaches are examples of different ways of thinking about what games are, but also reflect an interest in understanding the experiences that we have when we're playing these games and how these experiences are kind of created and designed and by the audiovisual haptic medium, by social and cultural contexts, and by other representational and cultural aspects, right? So when we start to think about games through an experiential lens, we can start to see basketball not as a rule-based physical game, but as a social game, chess as an intellectual game, a game like DayZ, where you, with permadeath as one of real suspense and anxiousness, but also immersion, and really look at the aspects of the game that draw people to them over other forms of entertainment. And so we can go through some of the ways that scholars, some of whom we've already talked about, Carl Waugh, who wrote Man, Play and Games in the 1960s, he identified 4 fundamental categories of play: competition, chance, make-believe, and vertigo motion, physical sensation. Marc LeBlanc argues that fun is merely a stand-in for a much more complex phenomena. LeBlanc poses in his work 8 kinds of fun: sensation, fantasy, narrative, challenge, fellowship, discovery, expression, and submission. So identifying the real range of ways in which games can be experienced in a pleasurable way. One of the things that I find really incomplete about this is the way, and this is a lot of emerging scholarship on this now, and I'd love to see someone take this up in their serious games concept, is how unpleasant experiences in games can be core to their appeal, much in the same way that the thrill and fear of a roller coaster or a haunted house is something that we seek out. Nick Yee is a scholar who did an online gaming motivations scale that we're going to ask you to have a go on in your tutorials. So he with a factor analysis approach, basically determined that there were emergent categories of players who were playing massively multiplayer online games. If you asked a whole range of questions, people would generally cluster together into certain types of players. There were those who were motivated to play and enjoyed the game for the achievement aspects. Things like advancing through the game's levels and story, mastering the mechanics, and beating other players. So these were kind of individual player types that were related together. And he condensed this down into a survey of just 39 questions. And finding these 10 sub-factors and 3 factors, which were these player types. There was also social players. People really emphasized this opportunity of MMO games to socialize with other players, build relationships, but also work together as a team and develop that identity. But then there was also, separately to this, immersion, discovery, exploring the virtual world that had been created, roleplay, customization, and escapism. So this features in the week 2 tutorial reading and activity, and I think is really interesting in the sense that this is a set of definitions not defined by someone externally, but is emergent from sets of questions asked of players, but is, I think, quite limited in the way that it really focuses on games in the MMO genre. Another example of a theory of kind of play's experience is the idea of flow. So flow is a theory developed by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which tries to kind of encompass the idea, the experience, the exhilarating pleasure that occurs when someone is engaged in an activity and feels very in control in his or her actions, where you don't, the passage of time kind of goes on without you realizing. You're so immersed in the task that you're doing that time passes, and it's very big in sports psychology and self-help books, because the idea is that if you can get into a flow state, if you can really access this perfect balance between you're being challenged but you're not being challenged too much, so you're constantly progressing, moving through this flow channel of having fun. It is a perfect opportunity for learning, for mastering physical skills in sports, and being as productive a human being as possible. This type of work I think is interesting because there's something inherently at stake here that I can really relate to. I know playing in games like Civilization, well, I've been in this situation where it's just one more turn and I'm like, oh, it's 3 a.m. what am I doing? I've been playing this for 36 hours in a row, because the games a lot of games are really good at accessing this channel of balance between challenge and boredom, and having really kind of pleasurable experiences where time passes, you don't realize you're hungry, you don't realize you're tired, but at the same time the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi really kind of pushes this to be a perfect state of humankind, and this is an experience that not everybody has, and is very much based on kind of some mumbo-jumbo pseudoscience underneath some of the kind of more outlandish claims that he makes about what you can do when you're in a flow state. I know I definitely never get into flow states when I'm learning, so to what real utility is it? I think another thing that often comes up in discussions of kind of, well, what are the experiences that we have, is this immersive fallacy. So we know that to play a game is to enjoy the artifice. There's a real willing suspension of disbelief. But when we're playing, we know that we're playing a game. So even though, say, Nick Yee had immersion as one of the fundamental player types in MMO games, we still know we're playing a game. But we have this willing suspension of disbelief to enjoy it and play along in many cases and act accordingly. So when you're playing, I want you to think about some of the ways you do actually pay attention to your body, the context in which you're playing, which is something very relevant to virtual reality, which we'll tackle later in the unit. So to kind of wrap up, Play and games are probably impossible to define, and seeking formal definitions are often exclusionist. Discussing these definitions does, however, help us understand the underlying phenomena that we're trying to study a lot better. And it also draws attention to how culture and society impacts the knowledge we have about a topic. What would be great for you is to think about what is it that interests you most about games and play, and bring that to your assignments and the readings that you focus on, and the weeks in which that you might tackle particularly for that final essay. So thanks very much for joining me on this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you next week. See ya.